Recently, we've discussed the role of environmental stressors in civil conflict. This time, we'll look at environmental stress and its impact on interstate conflict, or armed conflicts between sovereign states. These conflicts are comparatively infrequent, that is, compared to domestic armed conflicts or civil wars, which we discussed last time. Between 1816 and 2007, only 95 interstate wars occurred that claimed more than 1,000 lives on the battlefield. Over that same period, over 440 intrastate wars or civil wars occurred of similar magnitude. So while relatively infrequent, interstate wars can be particularly devastating. Those 443 wars claimed about 6 million lives on the battlefield, and that's nothing to sneeze at. The 95 interstate wars claimed well over 30 million. Chief among the contemporary environmental stressors affecting relations between states is water. Now, I've read a few different places that Mark Twain once said, "Whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over." I've tried to confirm whether Mark Twain ever said that. I can't, but I can confirm it was said by Warren Newfield of the South Dakota Department of Water at some point in the 1970s. That's a really less good story, but I think the sentiment still stands. Without being too maudlin about it, water is life. It's necessary for sustaining literally all of the systems around us that are important. Human systems, animal systems, plant systems. It provides a variety of ecosystem services, and it's an increasingly important source of electrical power. But despite its centrality to our existence, nearly 1 billion people lack reliable access to clean drinking water. And economic development promises to reduce the burden of disease associated with contaminated drinking water and a lack of access to basic sanitation. That's a good thing. The problem is that the same economic development and population growth will increase global demand for water pretty dramatically. A 2009 report by the Water Resources Group projects that by 2030, annual global freshwater needs will reach 6.9 trillion cubic meters, which is, as it turns out, about 64% more than the existing accessible, reliable, and sustainable supply. Now, this forecast is already pretty alarming, but it likely understates the magnitude of the real challenge, as it does not account for the impacts of global climate change on hydrological systems. Climate change will likely result in an increase in total precipitation at the global level, but regional patterns will vary pretty significantly. Rainfall will decline by more than 20% across North Africa and the Middle East, Central Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean, Southern Africa, the eastern part of the Amazon basin, and Western Australia, leading to declines in aggregate freshwater availability of 10 to 30%. The IPCC also forecasts that variability in rainfall will increase, leading to more numerous dry spells, but also more extreme precipitation events like flooding. Thus, climate change may increase aggregate surface water availability, but it will do so at the cost of increasing stress in some already vulnerable regions and making access to surface water less reliable due to increasingly variable precipitation patterns. Alright, so given that water is critical to sustaining human life and declining in relative abundance, there's concern that water will be both a cause of conflict and a cause of diplomatic tensions between countries in the future. If you're watching the news these days, this point probably seems pretty self-evident.
Let's talk about the Nile River and why Egypt and Ethiopia have been fighting over it. The problem is this dam being built in Ethiopia. Once it's finished, it'll be the most powerful hydroelectric dam in Africa.
አገሪቱ በድህነት ላይ ያለች ሀገር ስለሆነች የኤሌክትሪክ ሲስተሙ ለሁሉም ተደራሽ ይሆናል የሚል ሐሳብ አለኝ.
But Egypt says its supply of water is in danger of drying up.
الكل عامة قلقان خراب على الكل.
After years of talks, they're now saying they're close to signing a deal on how to share the water. But there are lots of details that need to be worked out. So why has it been so hard to end the battle for the Nile? Its official name is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and it's huge. When they're done building it, the reservoir will be bigger than Greater London and cover almost 1,700 square kilometers.
It's pretty much the largest project the government has ever embarked upon. The original cost of it was around $5 billion. It will probably be significantly more than that.
But before we get into the dispute about the dam itself, it helps to understand the Nile Basin and what's at stake. 11 African countries are in it, and 280 million people live there. The Nile is also, fun fact, the only major river that runs south to north. One of the river's tributaries, the Blue Nile, starts off in Lake Tana in Ethiopia and converges with the White Nile in Sudan's capital, Khartoum. From there, the Nile flows downstream to Egypt. There are several dams along the way, including Egypt's Aswan Dam. But Ethiopia is building its power plant upstream, right here on the border with Sudan. Now, as the name Renaissance suggests, this dam is supposed to revive Ethiopia's economy. It'll provide electricity to millions of Ethiopians. And that's big because right now more than 2/3 of the population aren't connected to the grid. That's about 75 million people.
Over several years, it will produce 6,000 megawatts. Ethiopia's current generating capacity is only 4,000 megawatts.
So this dam is also going to generate more power for Ethiopia than it needs, meaning it can export electricity. That's all very good news for Ethiopia. But if you ask Egypt, this dam will be catastrophic. The Nile has been at the center of Egyptian life for millennia. An entire ancient civilization was built around it and relied on the river for transport and irrigation. And that's still the case today. The country relies on the Nile for almost all of its water.
It's a rain-starved, largely desert country. So obviously, any potential interruption to the flow of the Nile is justifiably of huge concern for Egypt.
Egypt controls most of the flow of the River Nile into its country, at least for now.
Egypt's biggest worry is how quickly Ethiopia will fill the reservoir, and our colleagues at Al Jazeera Labs have studied a few scenarios. Say Ethiopia agrees to fill the reservoir over the next 10 years. AJ Labs says that would cut Egypt's water supply by 14% and destroy 18% of its farmland. If Ethiopia fills the dam more quickly, say over 7 years, 1/3 of Egypt's farmland would be lost, and a 5-year window would destroy half of that land. According to their simulations, this is how the Egyptian delta would change over those 10 years. So Ethiopia's best case scenario, filling the dam as soon as possible, is Egypt's worst nightmare. It's no wonder these negotiations have been tough. It was during the Arab Spring in 2011, while Egypt had a revolution on its hands, that Ethiopia started building the dam. Ever since then, Egyptian leaders have tried to stop the project, and military conflict never seemed far.
Last year, Ethiopia accused Egypt of sending rebels to neighboring Eritrea to sabotage the dam, prompting another Nile-sharing country, Sudan, to send its troops to its border.
In 2018, the operating manager of the Ethiopian dam, Semenu Bekele, was found dead.
Bekele's sudden death drew crowds and raised suspicions.
It was reported he'd been shot in broad daylight, which led to protests, but in the end, the authorities said Bekele took his own life. In 2019, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed even said no force could stop Ethiopia from building a dam. If there's a need to go to war, we could get millions readied. If some could fire a missile, others could use bombs. This is ultimately an age-old debate about who owns the Nile. In 1929, Egypt signed a treaty with Britain, a colonial power in Africa at the time, that basically guarantees its access to the Nile and gave Egypt a veto over construction projects on the river. But Ethiopia didn't sign that treaty. Then in 1999, all the Nile Basin countries, including Egypt and Ethiopia, signed an agreement on managing water. But that deal was compromised in 2010, when 6 of those countries decided to draw up another treaty. This time, Egypt rejected it because it threatened its historic rights to water.
Egypt's concern that if it moves into a new treaty governing the Nile Basin, then it will be left short of water resources, and also its control over the situation will be massively reduced.
And as far as Sudan goes, it's sort of caught in the middle. Egypt is Sudan's political ally, but the government supports the Renaissance Dam because it'll be a source of affordable energy and it will help regulate flooding.
والنيل الأزرق بالذات متمرد جدا. بعد مرات الطوبة شايفه ده قبل ما يشيلوه بيكون خلاص غرقوا اليوم.
The good news is that Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan are in talks with one another. The bad news is that they still haven't answered the tough questions. Questions like, when there's a drought, will Ethiopia consider Egypt's needs? And when is a drought a drought? Those conversations will only get tougher because more dams are being planned, populations are growing, and the climate is changing. all of which will make the Nile and the supply of water increasingly worth fighting over.
Now, globally, demand for water is massive and, needless to say, fundamental. Yet it's uneconomical to transport water long distances. Thus, most countries and populations are reliant on surface water, that is, water that collects in lakes, rivers, and wetlands, and groundwater, or water that exists in subsoil aquifers, accessed via wells, to satisfy their water needs. Surface water resources are often transboundary, meaning they are shared by two or more countries or jurisdictions within a country. For example, the Nile River originates in Ethiopia and Uganda, but crosses the territory of South Sudan and Sudan before ultimately making its way to Egypt, the second most populous of the Nile Basin countries, and the one, because of its desert landscape, that's actually most dependent on the river for freshwater. The Colorado River, closer to home, is transboundary both in the international and domestic senses. The river flows through the United States into Mexico, and within the United States flows from Colorado through the states of Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California. Now, these rivers are not particularly atypical. There are 263 transboundary lake and river basins worldwide, and most of these are shared peacefully. But sometimes they are not. Both of the basins we've talked about so far create upstream-downstream relationships between states or jurisdictions. Upstream-downstream relationships are those where one country is entirely upstream and can control how much of the water flows to the downstream country via dams. In the Nile, Ethiopia and Uganda are the upstream countries, while South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt are the downstream countries. This contrasts with situations in which the sharing countries each have direct access to the resource. Both Canada and the United States have direct access to Lake Superior, for instance. Upstream-downstream relations are typically more conflict-prone than those in which sharing countries have direct access. When both countries have direct access, there's no potential to really cut off the flow. Most shared water resources are governed peacefully, especially when countries use international river treaties, that is, formal agreements that specify how river resources are to be co-managed and how disputes over usage rights are to be resolved. These agreements typically specify how states will cooperate to monitor water levels, manage and render judgments regarding any usage disputes that arise, enforce the results of those judgments, and often create permanent commissions staffed with scientists and bureaucrats from member countries to carry out these tasks. By far the most famous of these commissions is the Permanent Indus Commission, which is composed of Indian and Pakistani officials and which co-manages the Indus River. Despite the history of conflict between the two countries, this commission has been in effect and operated continually since the 1960s. This is a good example of how international institutions can facilitate cooperation, even among military and political rivals. Now, one of the reasons that these commissions work, and a reason common to a lot of transboundary co-management institutions, is the difference between the high politics of statecraft and the low politics of natural resource management. Now, regarding the high politics, leaders face a variety of incentives and have competing claims on their actions and public positions. Moreover, they are the ones responsible for ginning up political support in times of crisis. That's how they got to be leaders in the first place. For this reason, they tend to see environmental issues as a tool of broader statecraft. It's a leverage point in negotiations, or a chip to be traded for concessions on some other issue. On the other hand, natural resource managers are nature-loving nerds. Seriously, go to a political convention and it's veneers, coiffed hair, and megawatt smiles sported by ambitious people as far as the eye can see. Go to the American Fisheries Society meetings, on the other hand, and it's people who often look like they just got done fishing. They're wearing shorts or ball caps or tivas, and I'm talking about tivas before they were cool again. Just Google the term hydrologists. These are not exactly fussy people. That is, they are practical people who are concerned with the best interests of the resource at hand. Their job is very specific to managing the resource, and because of the dominance of northern institutions in scientific matters, often the natural resource managers on the opposite sides of the table in the global south may have gone to school together. Members of the Permanent Indus Commission might have watched cricket together in London. That is, they're unconcerned with the high politics of India-Pakistan relations in general. They are more concerned with the specific issue of managing the river. They have a defined and unglamorous job to do. Because of this, in times of tension, they can reach out to one another as colleagues and old friends, rather than as government officials, or at least bring both identities to the table when they're negotiating. It's one of the reasons scientists are so often part of Track 2, or unofficial diplomatic efforts. The Nerd Tribe, of which yours truly is a proud member, is a decidedly cosmopolitan group. Just in the last couple of years, I've published or funded work on fisheries resources with Kenyan, Ugandan, Japanese, and Filipino scientists. And I'm currently serving on the IPCC with a person from Norway, a person from Belgium, and a person from India. And all of these are a mix of men and women. Now, I'm not trying to say that the sciences do not have issues with racial and gender and ethnic biases or inequalities, but I will say that our nerdiness unites us in ways that our national identities might not. And unlike politicians or the global business elite, for example, we know we're not getting rich or famous or powerful in doing this. These goals do not complicate, to as great an extent, the work that we do. That said, interstate wars over shared water resources, or water wars, typically arise when one country attempts to unilaterally divert the flow of a transboundary resource and restrict the amount flowing to downstream or other users, or pollutes that water in ways that degrade its use by downstream communities. Especially in dry regions, where alternative sources of water like rainfall are lacking, these moves can spark conflict. This stress is likely to increase under climate change, as many regions are expected to become more arid over time. The most famous example of a water war was the Six-Day War in 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Concerns over water were a major cause of the conflict. The Jordan River flows from its headwaters in Syria and Lebanon to the Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Tiberias, and onto the Dead Sea in the south. Historically, the Jordan River has supplied a large share of both Israel's and Jordan's fresh water. The salience of the Jordan River for Israel increased substantially after Israel began construction in 1949 on the National Water Carrier, a system of aqueducts and reservoirs designed to siphon water from the Sea of Galilee and deliver it to Israel's more arid and southern regions. These withdrawals would mean less water flowing downstream into Jordan, which at the time controlled both the west and east banks of the Jordan River. Both Jordan and Syria objected. Tensions flared for real in 1953 when Syrian artillery fired on an Israeli construction team that had begun construction for the intake of the national water carrier in a demilitarized zone established at the end of the 1948 and 1949 Arab-Israeli War. A U.S. brokered agreement over shared use of the water, which was known as the Johnston Plan, was negotiated in 1955 but ultimately not ratified by Jordan or Syria. In late 1964, Jordan, Syria, and their allies in the Arab League decided to take unilateral action against Israel's withdrawals from the Sea of Galilee, and began construction on projects that would divert flow from the Sea of Galilee's headwaters. This would reduce Israel's overall freshwater resources by nearly 10%. Israel responded to this plan almost immediately and with force in 1965, using air power, artillery, and tanks to destroy Syrian earth-moving equipment. These actions were the ones referenced by Ariel Sharon and would later come to be viewed as one of the major proximate causes of the Six-Day War. Now, the following clip is one perspective on the role of water in the Six-Day War. I want to be very clear. This video is not an objective piece of documentary filmmaking. It was produced by the Rohr Jewish Learning Institute, an organization founded and funded by a Hasidic Jewish sect. It is avowedly told from the, or at least a, Israeli perspective. But it's about the closest thing I could find to a comprehensive timeline. But the perspective here is pretty one-sided. You will find a needle in a haystack, by the way, before you find an unbiased take on anything even tangentially related to the Israel-Palestine conflict online.
Water is the elixir of life. But water allocation can be a deadly affair. In the Middle East, where temperaments mirror the soaring temperatures and prejudices flow freely, the price of water is sometimes paid in blood. After the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, its leaders put their heads together to develop a water plan that would provide desperately needed fluid for drinking and irrigation purposes. Israel came up with the National Water Carrier Project, a plan to draw water from the Kinneret Lake in its north through a technically challenging network of canals, tunnels, and pipes covering a diversity of terrain and elevations, all the way down Israel's west coast to its populated center and to its parched agricultural south. The Kinneret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, is a picturesque lake in Israel's north, ringed with beaches, meadows, and mountains. It is approximately 35 miles in circumference and 150 feet at its deepest point. It held enough water to meet the demands of Israel's expanding population for decades. However, this wonderful freshwater asset is inherently fragile. It is fed mainly by the waters of the Jordan River, which originates in the gushing springs and tributaries of mountainous Lebanon and Syria. Two rivers are especially critical to the aqua that courses down the Jordan Valley before flowing into Lake Kinneret, the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria. Without these two rivers, the Jordan's waters would drop dramatically. The Kinneret's water level would also drop, and its remaining freshwater would be irreversibly salinized by the salt springs sitting on its bed. While Israel simply wanted to have a drink, their plan drew the ire of her neighbors. Having failed to eradicate Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, the Arab world swore to at least limit her growth and economic success. Israel's water project threatened to severely undermine that goal. When Israel began construction on the national water carrier in July of 1953, the war over water was set in motion. Hostilities emerged in 3 stages that served as stepping stones towards a full-scale Arab-Israeli conflict. As Israel's tractors bit into soil north of the Kinneret, Syrian artillery units roared into action, bombarding the Israeli construction site. Syria demanded that the United Nations intervene against Israel. The Security Council wished to uphold Israel's right to resume work on its water project, but the Soviets vetoed the resolution. Israel modified its plan, moved its construction site further from Syria's border, and its engineers went back to work. But the dispute was just warming up. Syria and Jordan then colluded to divert the Yarmouk River. The Yarmouk would be forced to flow away from Israel and instead supplement the Jordanians' irrigation needs. United States President Eisenhower dispatched Ambassador Eric Johnston to resolve the situation. The result was the 1955 Johnston Plan, a brave attempt at coexistence and water sharing that Israel embraced and that the Arab League unofficially resolved to abide by, at least temporarily. The waves of war were thereby stilled for most of a decade. In 1964, Israel completed the national water carrier. It was 81 miles in length and had taken years to build at the cost of hundreds of millions of Israeli lira. But it was worth every lira. The carrier was capable of funneling an astonishing 19 million gallons of water per hour, an achievement far too great for Israel's Arab neighbors to swallow. The Arab League hastily convened in Cairo. Desperate to wreck Israel's water resource, they devised a reckless plan. The Headwater Diversion Plan called for the reduction of the water carrier's capacity by 35% by diverting its headwaters, both the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria, into the Yarmouk River, deep in Jordanian territory. At the same time, the Arab League clarified that this was not simply a war about liquid, but rather liquidation. Since the existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation, the diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence. Accordingly, the Arab states have to prepare so that if necessary results are not achieved, collective Arab military preparations will constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel. Israel warned that the Headwater Diversion Plan would infringe on its sovereign rights. In other words, it would be considered an act of war. The Arabs, however, were not opposed to a war. They launched their project, and the skirmishes began. In 1965, there were 3 high-profile border clashes. The Syrian military attacked Israeli farmers and army patrols, and Israel responded by sending tanks and artillery to destroy the Arab heavy earth-moving machines that were working on the diversion plan. The Arab states eventually abandoned their project, but the war over water inspired them to plot a war of extermination against Israel. hostilities between Israel and Syria spiraled over the next 2 years, with Syria using the Golan Heights to rain artillery upon unprotected Israeli farms and villages in the plains below. In the first quarter of 1967, there were over 270 border incidents of sabotage and attack directed against Israel. A view of the war to come came on April 7th when Syria fired at Israeli farmers. Israel responded with artillery, and the fight escalated. Israel sent planes against Syrian positions and villages, and in an ensuing aerial dogfight, Israel downed 6 Syrian fighter jets and chased the remainder all the way back to Damascus. Ariel Sharon later observed, "People generally regard June 5, 1967, as the day the Six-Day War began. That is the official date. But in reality, it started 2.5 years earlier, on the day Israel decided to act against the diversion of the Jordan River."
The Six-Day War ended with Israel's occupation of the West Bank of the Jordan River, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. Control of the Golan Heights allowed Israel unfettered access to the Sea of Galilee. Today, however, Israel is much less reliant on the Sea of Galilee than in years past. One way to lessen conflict over shared resources is to make them less vital to national interests. Israel achieved this by investing in desalination plants, facilities that convert saltwater into freshwater, which now produce more freshwater than Israel consumes. These investments, along with conservation efforts, have radically lessened Israel's dependence on the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Six-Day War is the most prominent example of a water war, the kind of war Peter Gleich is really concerned about and about which you read. But was water really the primary cause? Would conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors have been likely even in the absence of the dispute over the Jordan River? That is, was this war overdetermined? Were many more causes present than necessary or reasonable to explain the outcome? Now, the concept of overdetermination, in a statistical or theoretical sense, can get pretty technical, but it's actually covered pretty nicely by Kumail Nanjiani in this old stand-up bit. Note, he's going to swear a little bit, so those of you with a fairly sensitive palate might want to skip it. But I think we're all adults here.
Have you guys heard of this new drug called cheese? Like that's this cheese. You've heard of it? No. Okay. It's that's like a street name for it. It's like a new drug cocktail called cheese. And I read like 4 or 5 news reports on it. They were like, "There's this new drug called cheese. It's sweeping the nation. Kids in the Midwest are doing it. It's an epidemic. It's a new drug. It's an epidemic." Then I looked up what cheese is. Cheese is Tylenol PM and heroin. So really, it's heroin. It's mostly heroin. Heroin's doing the heavy lifting in this drug cocktail. It's not a new drug. It's mostly heroin. I can't put heroin on pancakes and go, "I have a new drug." I call it shake cakes. You eat them every day. If you stop, you'll get the shakes. Don't forget the special shake sauce. It's maple syrup and heroin. Pour that on there. It's not a new drug, is my point. It's mostly heroin. I think the last new drug was crystal meth, which you had to make in your bathtub. And if you fucked up while you were making it, everything would explode and you would die. That's how dangerous that drug is. Just trying to make it can kill you. And you make it just from shit you get at the store. To make cheese, you still need heroin. Just do the heroin. You already have heroin. Just do the heroin. That's my message to you guys.
His point?
Right?
The Tylenol PM didn't really need to be there for those people to be getting high. Now, similarly, in thinking about the Six-Day War, it's hard to argue water was the only cause of the conflict. A lot of other factors pointed in the direction of war. The competing claims over the Jordan River may have heightened tensions, but Israel, Jordan, and Syria were already among the most likely cases for conflict. A democracy, Israel, confronting autocracies, Jordan and Syria, with extremely limited economic linkages and a history of recent past conflict. There had already been Arab-Israeli wars in 1948 and 1956. Many most likely cases for water wars, like the Six-Day War or conflict over the Indus River between India and Pakistan, are the most likely cases for conflict in general for reasons that have nothing to do with water. Now, why are these cases most likely? Again, we can look to contextual factors. In this setting, the economic, political, and institutional relationships between states that make interstate conflict more or less likely between countries. Collectively, we can refer to these factors as the Kantian tripod. Immanuel Kant was a Prussian-born, German-speaking philosopher who has become one of the most influential figures in modern Western philosophy. Among his many works was 1795's Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, in which he outlined 3 conditions that would need to be present in order for a general condition of peace to exist between governments. First, that they be republican, i.e. democratic or representative democratic in nature. 2, commerce and travel of persons between those states. And 3, membership in international institutions, or what he conceived of as a worldwide representative government composed of the sovereign states of the world, kind of like a progenitor to the League of Nations, or what's now known as the United Nations. So, the legs of the tripod are 1, that both governments are democratic, 2, there's commerce and travel of persons between those states, and 3, they jointly belong to international institutions that provide ready-made fora for interacting and hopefully arriving at peaceful solutions to their disputes. When all legs are present, peace is much more likely to obtain, even when competing claims over the resource are present. For instance, the United States and Canada have this ongoing boundary dispute over the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic Circle, which many think holds vast untapped fisheries and natural gas deposits. But so far, these competing claims have been handled peacefully through bilateral negotiations. I'm guessing none of you went to sleep last night worried about a Canada-US maritime war. When none of these legs are present, however, as was arguably the case between Israel and Jordan and other neighbors, prospects for peace are going to be more dim. So, how does all of this bode for the ongoing dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile River? We'll discuss this case in greater depth in class.